Imagine the acrid smell of burnt coffee that mixed with the mold that permeated the beige walls of the office. It was a suffocating Monday. And I was sitting in front of a pile of reports that made no sense even to the people who wrote them, trying to find some spark of dignity in the midst of the corporate chaos. My name is Kayla. I'm 29 years old, and until that day I believed that a little patience and resilience were enough to survive in the corporate world. But everything changed when my boss, Mr. Donnelly, a man in a tight suit and an oily smile, stopped in front of my desk holding a Starbucks cup. He took an exaggerated sip, licking his lips as if he wanted to savor how unattainable it was for me. Starbucks is a luxury. Too fancy for your salary, don't you think, Kayla? He blurted, loud enough for everyone in the department to hear and laugh in unison. I felt my face heat up, not only with embarrassment, but with a cold hatred that settled in the pit of my stomach. I looked around and saw colleagues looking away, silent accomplices in this miserable theater. As he walked away, the sweet smell of caramel from his latte seemed to mock me. I could have swallowed that humiliation, like so many others, but something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the sum of years of unrecognized work, or maybe the memory of my mother saying that no one has the right to measure your worth by what you can or cannot buy. That night, lying on a hard mattress in my tiny studio, I opened my laptop and began to sketch the outline of something that would change everything. I researched, made calls, and pulled up old contacts. I discovered that the owner of the strip mall, the same one where Starbucks was located, was mired in debt and willing to negotiate. Each document I signed in the following days was like driving a nail into the coffin of my boss's arrogance. But I didn't just want to buy a coffee shop. I wanted to buy the entire set where he had embarrassed me. And so it was that, with the help of quiet investors who believed in my proposal to revitalize the place, I signed the contract that made me the owner of every inch of that strip mall, including, ironically, the Starbucks he so flaunted. When I got the keys, I ran out onto the sidewalk and felt the hot concrete beneath my heels. I owned the stage where he acted out his humiliations, and I couldn't wait to prepare the next act on the days that followed. I made a point of keeping my secret. I walked the strip mall with measured steps, noting every peeling facade, every precariously hanging sign. At night, I sat on the floor of my small apartment with the blueprints of the place spread out around me, marking the priority renovations in red pen. I lived on instant noodles and black coffee. But the hunger that burned deepest wasn't for food, it was the hunger to see him metaphorically kneel before the new balance of power. When the first "under new management" sign went up, I felt a little dizzy. This was the same place where I had been humiliated, but now every inch of the grimy floor belonged to me. It wasn't long before word spread around town. Investors began approaching me with offers to open franchises there, attracted by its strategic location. Meanwhile, Mr. Donnelly, completely oblivious to the swirling turmoil, continued to show off his tall cups of coffee, laughing out loud at jokes about people who think they're important because they got some loan or other. It was a muggy, almost sweltering morning when I decided to put the next act of my plan into motion. I scheduled a visit to our company's branch office to analyze local marketing opportunities. I brought with me a freshly printed brochure featuring the new strip mall layout and the shiny logos of the new partners who were signing on. When I arrived at the office, the room seemed to shrink. People were whispering, glances were piercing the air. I walked straight into Donnelly's office without even knocking. He had his feet propped up on his desk, laughing into the phone, but when he saw me, he stopped talking and arched an eyebrow in disdain. "Kayla, I hope you have a good reason to barge into my office," he said, twirling a pen between his fingers. I handed him the brochure without saying a word. He flipped through the pages, and the smile slowly faded, like a mask melted by the heat. "You bought the strip mall?" His voice came out in a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to savor the moment, the sound of his ego shattering into 1,000 pieces. Finally, I put my hands on the table, brought my face close to his, and whispered, "I didn't just buy it, I'm remodeling it. And the rent on Starbucks, like the other stores, is going to double. They've already agreed." He slumped in his chair, pale as wax. The irony crushed him. For years, he had reminded me how small I was. How irrelevant, how incapable of even affording expensive coffee. Now, every sip I took there would help pay for my own pocket money. But that wasn't all. I wanted more. I wanted him to be forced to beg. Over the next few weeks, I organized events at the location, food fairs, concerts by local bands, and encouraged the press to come. The business grew so much that his store couldn't ignore it. To stay competitive, Starbucks had to extend its hours, hire more employees, and pay additional fees. All of this went straight to the new management's account. My account. Donnelly began to look increasingly haggard. The jokes disappeared. His suits remained neat, but his expression was always tight, like someone chewing glass. One day I was called to a corporate meeting, where he, now desperate to maintain profits, was trying to negotiate cost cuts at the branch. "Maybe the new management of the strip mall could give us a discount on the rent," he said, looking at me as if he were suddenly capable of humility. I calmly crossed my legs and let the silence stretch until it embarrassed him completely. Then I leaned forward and said, almost plaintively, "I'm sorry, but my investors don't approve of any reductions. This is an ambitious project, and it needs full returns. I'm sure you understand. After all, business is business. Isn't that what I've always said?" He didn't answer. His eyes turned red, and I had the perverse pleasure of watching him swallow hard. Throughout my career, I had been trained to smile, to be kind, to take orders, to swallow insults. There, for the first time, I tasted absolute dominance. I started going there more often, sitting on outdoor benches with my own Starbucks, watching the action. Sometimes I would see him hurry in and out, avoiding looking at me. Other times, I would see old colleagues nodding silently, unsure whether to greet me or ask for a job. The climax was when I received a proposal from an international coffee shop chain interested in occupying the Starbucks space. They offered a 10-year lease, with payment in advance. When I analyzed the clauses, I realized that in order to accept the new tenant, I would have to terminate the Starbucks lease, something that was perfectly foreseen by loopholes in the old document, which gave me the freedom to remodel the store mix at my discretion, as long as I received financial compensation. From a cold perspective, it was just business. But from a human perspective, it was twisted justice. I sent an official notice informing him that the Starbucks lease would not be renewed. The look on Donnelly's face when he received the notice was something I will never forget. He tried to protest, called me for a private conversation, and even said that we could reevaluate my position in the company if I reconsidered. I laughed in his face. Literally laughed, something I never thought I would do. This man, who for so long had enjoyed humiliating people in public, was now begging. The following month, construction began to prepare the space for the new chain. The Starbucks doors were closed, and the windows were covered with brown paper. Employees walked around with their heads down, some in tears, and Donnelly. He was hastily transferred to another city, in a clear move by the headquarters to save him from public embarrassment. I heard from former colleagues that he was trying to get back on his feet, but he carried the weight of that failure written all over his face. Curiously, I never saw him again. I didn't miss him. For me, what mattered was not keeping the enemy close, but making sure he never felt untouchable again. On the day the new coffee shop opened, I made sure to be there. I arrived early, greeted each vendor, chatted with the musicians who were setting up the stage. When they opened the doors, lines formed instantly. People laughed, children ran, the air was filled with the smell of freshly ground beans. I sat at a table outside, with a perfect view of the old space where Donnelly had reigned. I ordered the most expensive coffee on the menu, not because I needed it, but because I wanted it. I watched the sun set behind the shops I now ran, and in the silence of that evening, I realized that my revenge wasn't just against him, it was against the entire system that thinks it's okay to humiliate those who have less. It was against every laugh I endured in silence. Against every unfair salary, every "it's not time for a promotion," every look of contempt. Deep down, I didn't feel joy. It wasn't happiness, or relief. It was something rawer, more primal. It was the weight of the scales finally tipping, even if only for a moment, in my favor. And as twisted as that was, it was all I wanted. When I finished my coffee, I stood up, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked to my car. As I passed the gleaming facade of my strip mall, I lightly touched the cold wall, almost like saying goodbye to a friend. I got in my car and drove away, without music, without thoughts. Because some stories don't need applause or happy endings, they just need silence to echo on their own. A few weeks after that grand opening, as the dust of victory began to settle, Kayla realized that the real essence of what she had done was not just about humiliating Donnelly. As she walked through the hallways of the renovated strip mall, she saw old-timers with new faces, people who had once been on the verge of closing down who now smiled as they tallied their sales. The parking lot was packed, the constant coming and going of shoppers, the trucks unloading boxes of products. It all carried a weight that went beyond a personal reckoning. It was as if each brick, each shiny sign, was a scar turned into a medal. But even as the place flourished, something lingered inside her, a small, insistent voice wondering if the void left by her humiliations had truly been filled. One night when she got home, Kayla threw her keys on the counter and sank onto the couch. The apartment was bigger now, in a better neighborhood, a direct result of her investment success. The walls, still bare, almost impersonal, reflected the yellow light from the chandelier. She closed her eyes and found herself traveling back in time, to her first interview at the company where she met Donnelly. She remembered the nervousness, the sweaty hands gripping the resume she had printed out at an internet cafe because she didn't have a printer at home. She remembered the way he had shaken her hand, his appraising gaze moving from her worn shoes to the necklace she had inherited from her mother. Even at that beginning, there had been something in his smile that had felt fake, a veneer of condescension that she had not been able to identify at first. For years, Kayla had tried to convince herself that this was part of the corporate game, that it was normal to endure small humiliations in exchange for stability. Now, sitting in the expensive silence of her new home, she recognized how much it had shaped her, like an invisible press bending her spine, little by little. In the following days, she began receiving invitations to give talks about entrepreneurship and overcoming obstacles. Journalists wanted to interview the woman who turned humiliation into an empire. She accepted some proposals, especially those that could attract new investors or open doors for other projects. But every time she went on stage and adjusted her microphone, she felt a little uncomfortable. People wanted a motivational narrative. They expected ready-made phrases about believing in your dreams or turning criticism into fuel. Kayla gave them what they wanted, but deep down, she knew that the story was much dirtier, made up of accumulated resentment, sleepless nights, and decisions filled with calculated coldness. It was not a corporate fairy tale. It was a chronicle of resentment that, by chance, had resulted in profits. One day, as she was leaving one of these lectures, she was approached by a short woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, holding a notebook and shaking slightly. "Can I just say one thing?" "Thank you," she said. "I worked with Donnelly years ago, and I watched him destroy the self-esteem of so many young women. When I heard about what you did, I felt like, in some way, we had all received justice." Kayla took her hand, squeezed it gently, but she didn't know how to respond. It wasn't until she got into her car that she realized she was crying. It wasn't tears of sadness, or tears of joy. It was as if an old floodgate had finally opened, releasing everything that had been trapped inside. Over the next few months, Kayla began investing in other projects. She bought stakes in local startups, helped small retailers modernize their businesses, and partnered with a nonprofit that trained unemployed women in retail. It all sounded noble and made headlines, but inside she struggled with the same restlessness. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, dreaming that she was sitting across from Donnelly again, listening to him laugh as he sneered at her imaginary coffee. Other times, she would dream that she was the one laughing, and that his face was distorting, becoming that of other men who had belittled her before, the manager at her first job, who told her to smile more because it would sell better, the college professor who told her she would never have a head for numbers, the ex-boyfriend who mocked the way she pronounced certain words. She would wake up sweaty, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling, unable to tell if it was a nightmare or catharsis. An unexpected invitation arrived by email one rainy afternoon. A national shopping mall chain wanted Kayla to join its board of directors. The salary was obscene, the bonuses even more so. She studied the contract for hours, listing the pros and cons on scribbled sheets of paper that ended up scattered across the floor. In the end, she accepted, not so much for the money, although it was a powerful anesthetic, but because she wanted to be in the rooms where decisions were actually made. She wanted to influence who would get crushed and who would get a chance. It might be cruel to admit it, but she had found a way to balance the playing field. On her first day in her new role, she sat at a polished mahogany table, flanked by executives who were talking in figures the size of the GDPs of small countries. The air was chilly, the carpet seemed to swallow the sound of their footsteps. As the chairman of the board gave a speech about expansion and strategic cuts, Kayla paid attention not to the words but to the faces. She wondered how many of them had humiliated someone to get where they were. How many smiled politely but took secret pleasure in grinding others to dust. When it was her turn to speak, she adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and announced a new program to finance small retailers who wanted to enter smaller malls, with reduced rent for the first 6 months. Some faces frowned, others said interesting, but Kayla just kept going, listing projections that made the proposal irrefutable. She left that meeting certain that she was beginning to write a different story, even if it was scribbled in the same ink stained by resentment. One morning, sleepless, Kayla got up and went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. She leaned against the cold sink and stared out at the city. The streetlights threw yellow stains on the wet asphalt, and the wind carried forgotten papers. She picked up her cell phone, opened Google, and typed in Donnelly's name. She found a company profile that was barely updated, a few mentions in old news stories. No scandals, nothing that would reveal the fall he had taken. She felt a strange pang. It wasn't regret, but something more like disappointment. She wanted the whole world to know what he had done. She wanted every laugh he made to be public, that he would be forced to carry his past like an exposed burden. But the world rarely works that way. Silence is too comfortable for those who have no interest in the truth. When she returned to her room, she realized how much too big the bed seemed. She lay down on her side, hugging the pillow, and decided that she would not seek any more news of him. It didn't matter. The real triumph was not in watching him beg, but in ensuring that he would never again occupy that stage of superiority to which he clung so much. Her true trophy was the echo of that afternoon when he had stood pale, stammering, begging for a favor that she had refused without blinking. That sound, etched in her memory, was more precious than any headline or inspirational speech. Time passed, and the strip mall continued to thrive. The events Kayla hosted became a local tradition. Entire families would show up on Saturdays, and food trucks would line up around corners. Sometimes she would sit on inconspicuous benches, wearing sunglasses, just watching the world go by. It was her way of making sure that the place that had once been the scene of her embarrassment was now alive for entirely new reasons, bigger than its own history. One afternoon, a girl no older than 10 ran, tripped, and nearly fell right in front of the bench where Kayla was sitting. She jumped up, startled, but when she realized she hadn't hurt herself, she burst out laughing, adjusted her headband, and jumped away. Kayla followed the sound of the echoing laughter, feeling something loosen in her chest. For a few moments, it was as if all her sorrows dissolved in the warm breeze that ruffled the trees in the parking lot. It wasn't redemption. It never would be. But it was, perhaps, the closest thing to peace she could ever achieve. Kayla began to notice the less obvious consequences of her victory when the euphoria of the first few years gave way to a meticulously structured routine, dominated by meetings, contracts, and financial reports. Although she was the master of her own time on paper, in practice she was always subject to demands that multiplied like pests in a fertile field. The people around her began to treat her with a mixture of respect and fear, measuring their words before asking any question, avoiding openly contradicting her. At first, this fed her, reinforcing the image of power that she had built brick by brick. As the months passed, however, she began to realize how lonely this detachment was. In the hallways of the offices where she now roamed as an influential investor, Kayla noticed little scenes that brought back uncomfortable memories. An intern carrying a stack of boxes while her boss barked orders, a junior analyst being rudely interrupted during presentations, receptionists listening to crude jokes and smiling sheepishly. Once, she caught herself staring at a young employee leaving a conference room with red eyes. It froze her for a moment. She remembered herself holding back tears in the bathroom so as not to smudge her cheap mascara, repeating under her breath that someday this would all make sense. That night, instead of reviewing spreadsheets or contracts, Kayla wandered around the house like a ghost. She couldn't decide whether she felt guilt or just a vague shame for having risen so high without changing the system that had crushed her. She had simply put herself on top of it. With power came tempting offers. Banks approached her with proposals for exclusive funds. Politicians sought support for dubious projects. Lobbyists sent expensive gifts. Kayla began to decline automatically, but the pressure was constant. And at times, she found herself considering whether she could negotiate on a small scale, as long as there was some community benefit in the end. It was during one of these periods of moral fragility that she met Tristan Ray, a corporate lawyer sent by a group of international funds interested in acquiring a stake in her strip mall. He was articulate, with a sober smile, and eyes that always seemed to calculate future gains. They began as purely professional meetings, but quickly evolved into dinners. Long conversations over impeccable wines, and exchanges of confidences that made her feel something close to vulnerability again. Tristan seemed to understand Kayla on a level no one else did. He'd come from the bottom himself, telling her stories about his childhood in rural Georgia, his alcoholic father, his fights over unpaid bills. Kayla felt oddly comfortable confessing her small weaknesses, talking about the dreams she'd had but hadn't yet realized. But she also noticed how he'd occasionally asked her covert questions that seemed to map out her ethical boundaries. He'd ask her what she thought of certain aggressive mergers, of buying up neighboring properties only to bulldoze them and eliminate competition, of using campaign funds to free up city projects in exchange for tax breaks. Every time she said, "I don't know if I'd do that," he'd just smile, as if filing away information for later. The relationship had evolved too quickly. Soon they were sharing weekends at resorts, traveling to conferences in cities that served only as a backdrop to the intense flame that seemed to consume them. Kayla, accustomed to dominating every conversation, was surprised by Tristan's intelligence, which could turn arguments against her without having to raise his voice. It was during one of these meetings that he made the proposal that would shake everything up. They were on a large balcony, the sea lapping below, nearly empty glasses resting on the wall. Tristan spoke with the naturalness of someone offering more wine. He said that the International Fund planned to invest heavily not only in the strip mall, but in the entire neighborhood. To do this, they needed Kayla to lead a movement to pressure the local council to approve zoning changes. This would involve relocating dozens of small retailers that she herself had helped build, in exchange for luxury projects that would triple the value of the properties. Kayla remained silent for too long. Tristan studied her with that meticulous gaze, almost affectionate, but clearly predatory. She remembered the gray-haired lady who had thanked her long ago, the shopkeepers who had smiled at her when she arrived at the strip mall, the girl in the tiara who had run and nearly fallen at her feet. She also remembered the taste of revenge, how much she had savored seeing Donnelly bent over before her, how much it had fed a dark hunger that might never be satisfied. She thought about saying no, that she would not be an accomplice in evicting families, in suffocating dreams that were still budding. But her mouth did not move. Tristan continued, drawing numbers in the air, talking about stratospheric profits, about the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finally become someone that even Donnelly wouldn't dare dream of challenging. When he finished, he gently took her hand and told her that he trusted Kayla's judgment to do what was best. She spent the rest of the night in a daze, accepting caresses, trying to silence the inner voice that screamed against the path that was opening up. On her way home, Kayla began to feel sick with anxiety. She didn't sleep more than 3 hours at a time, skipped meals, and spent hours staring at documents she hadn't read. She began to discreetly research each store owner who would have to leave if she approved the project. She discovered that many were finally paying off old debts, that others had hired relatives, betting their entire future on this place. With each new piece of information, the weight grew, as if stones were being tied to her chest. Tristan began to put pressure on her subtly, sending messages with technical terms, pre-written contracts, reminders about scheduled meetings. At one point, Kayla exploded at him, saying that she needed time, that it wasn't that simple. He just smiled and said that too much time costs money. On a sweltering late afternoon, she returned to the strip mall and walked alone through the shops. She greeted a man polishing the window of his small bookstore, heard the enthusiastic thanks of a dress shop owner who talked about the first time she had managed to hire 2 more clerks. It all tore her apart inside. It was then that she understood that she was facing a crossroads much more serious than any dispute with Donnelly. Back then, the fight had been about revenge, about proving that she was not small. Now, it was about deciding who would pay the price for her power. Whether she would give in to the temptation to crush others in order to keep climbing, exactly as the man she hated so much had done. That night, Kayla called Tristan. She didn't talk about the project, about zoning, about profits. She just said she didn't want to see him anymore. There was a tense silence on the other end. Then he let out a low laugh, as if he had anticipated this, and wished her luck in a tone that carried a veiled threat. She turned off her phone and put it away from the bedroom, as if she feared he might continue whispering promises in her sleep. The next day arrived gray, the city drenched in a light rain that seemed to prolong an invisible morning. Kayla spent hours organizing documents, re-evaluating investments, transferring small chunks of her shares to funds that would guarantee more stability for local merchants, shielding the strip mall from future predatory attacks. At the end of the day, exhausted but strangely at peace, she went for a walk without a destination. She passed through squares, watched children playing, heard fragmented conversations between couples, ladies discussing the price of vegetables. Each sound seemed to have more value than any spreadsheet she had ever looked through. Back in the car, she took a deep breath and realized that she would never have the kind of clean, perfect victory that appeared on magazine covers with motivational captions. Her story was made of scars, of setbacks, of a grudge that would never completely disappear. But for the first time in a long time, she was certain that she didn't have to follow the rotten script that so many expected of her. She didn't have to repeat the cycle of abuse that had nearly destroyed her. In the months that followed, Kayla kept her distance from the large conglomerates that sought to turn her into a mascot for their interests. She dedicated herself to consolidating the strip mall as a community hub, with cultural fairs, partnerships with schools, and incentive programs for young entrepreneurs. She declined invitations to climb another rung in the corporate food chain, aware that each new rung would come covered in other people's blood. There were still nights when I dreamed of Donnelly, but he seemed smaller and smaller, almost a hazy shadow. I would wake up, look at the ceiling, and realize that what had once been a monster was now nothing more than a powerless specter. And so, in a silent cycle, Kayla began to bury her demons. Not because she had forgiven them, but because she no longer needed them to remind her of who she was. Years had passed since Kayla had said no to Tristan and sealed the strip mall's fate as a community-based space. The mall had flourished organically, attracting local artists, small family-owned franchises, and seasonal markets that had become traditional neighborhood staples. What had once been fueled by an almost animalistic need for revenge now seemed to have morphed into something bigger, sustained by the lively energy of the people who depended on it. Kayla stopped by regularly, but she no longer had to oversee every detail. She had built a committed management team that understood the importance of balancing profit and humanity, something that had taken her a lifetime to learn. However, the corporate world is a hungry organism that never stops looking for fresh meat. With the success of the strip mall consolidated and Kayla's image tied to this exemplary revitalization case, more complex proposals soon began to emerge. Banks, funds, and even political groups began to approach her to lead projects to recover degraded areas in other cities. Kayla's first reaction was to refuse, claiming lack of interest, but something began to quietly unsettle her. She wondered if she could perhaps replicate this in other places, multiply stories like the one she had experienced there. As much as she feared getting lost in the labyrinth of greed again, there was a legitimate seed that pulsed, the possibility of building spaces where small stories could flourish far from the relentless logic of conglomerates. It was at a conference on sustainable urbanism in Chicago that she met Lucian Archer, a Canadian investor who was respected for his efforts to rehabilitate declining port areas. He had a quiet magnetism, not the outgoing type like Tristan had been. His low voice forced the speaker to lean in and pay closer attention. Unlike the corporate predators Kayla had learned to read, Lucian didn't sell easy promises. He talked about integrating commerce and local culture, about supply chains that prioritized small producers, about parks open to the public funded by retailer dividends. It was almost disconcerting to hear someone at the top of the chain speak like that, in terms she herself had learned to defend. After some conversation, Kayla agreed to visit Toronto to see one of Lucian's projects. Together, they walked through alleys that were once hotbeds of drug trafficking and prostitution and that were now home to cafes run by former homeless people, craft workshops, and small publishing houses. Lucian seemed to have a real devotion to social impact, but he was not naive. His financial statements showed sustainable profits, solid contracts, and reinvestment of part of the profits in community programs. Kayla was fascinated and, almost without realizing it, began to mentally sketch out how she could replicate this model in American cities that had been abandoned by decades of failed public policies. When she returned, she spent all night sketching out plans, analyzing demographic data, mapping neighborhoods that traditional investors had forgotten about. It was as if her hunger for victory had finally found cleaner fuel. For weeks, she felt invincible. But the real world rarely allows revolutions without hidden costs. Soon the first objections arose. City councils resistant to change, speculative landowners who inflated prices at the slightest sign of interest, local business groups fearful of losing their fiefdom. Kayla met each obstacle with the pragmatism she had learned the hard way, but something new began to grow in the shadows. One morning, he received a visit to his office from Frank Behrman, a veteran attorney who represented a consortium of local real estate companies. The man's face was flushed, almost puffy, and he spoke in a tone that bordered on mockery. He said that his group was willing to make things much easier if Kayla would consider including them in the project, giving them priority in acquiring the most valuable lots. When she refused, arguing that doing so would contradict the logic of the project, Behrman shrugged, took a small sheaf of documents from his jacket, and pushed them across the table. They were detailed records of minor bureaucratic infractions committed by the strip mall in recent years. Late permits, environmental reports full of technical details, tax issues so obscure that even its accountants had not detected them. Behrman didn't need to say it directly. The message was clear. If he wanted peace and quiet to continue his plans, he would have to make concessions. Kayla felt hot anger rise up her neck. She stood up so quickly that her chair nearly tipped over. She ordered him to leave and said she would prosecute any attempts at blackmail. Behrman just smiled, straightened his tie, and walked out with the slow pace of someone who was certain the game was far from over. In the following days, she began receiving notifications from city agencies demanding document updates. Small fines began to arrive. Anonymous complaints began to surface, accusing the strip mall of health irregularities. And even a surprise audit was launched to investigate the store owner's financial transactions. Kayla immediately understood that Behrman's invisible hand was behind it all. The store owners began to get nervous, some fearing they would have to close their doors if the fees continued to pile up. She spent sleepless nights answering emails, coordinating with lawyers, trying to protect what she had built. Lucien called frequently, offering technical and legal support, but also asking if she would rather back off. It's normal for them to tighten the siege like this. Sometimes taking a few steps back guarantees the bigger project down the road. But Kayla couldn't bear the thought of giving in. She felt that her entire history, from the first time she had been humiliated by Donnelly to every brick laid in the strip mall, demanded an uncompromising stance. She wouldn't back down, even if it meant risking everything. Then Behrman came back, sending more subtle messengers. A consultant showed up offering to mediate the conflict from the outside, proposing a generous donation to the strip mall's community fund in exchange for an informal commitment to a future partnership. Kayla dispatched the man in less than 5 minutes. In response, the following week, a notice of foreclosure was posted on the entrances of 2 stores for alleged electrical violations. Fear spread like wildfire. Rumors began to circulate that the strip mall was going bankrupt, that Kayla would lose everything and drag everyone down with it. In the midst of this turmoil, Kayla began to relive Donnelly's face in her dreams, no longer proud, but fragmented into shards that were reconstituted into new figures. Behrman's face, Lucien's studied smile, Tristan's gaze. She always woke up sweaty, clutching her pillow as if trying not to fall off a cliff. She began to question whether the problem was within her, whether there was some structural flaw in her obsession with confronting those who represented the established power. Perhaps she was so addicted to the fight that she no longer knew who she was without an enemy. When the pressure reached its peak, Kayla called a special meeting with all the shopkeepers. She was honest. She explained the advances that the real estate consortium had been making, the legal traps that could jeopardize the future of the place. She offered them the chance to look for other locations, to move their businesses while there was still time. But what she received in response was a heavy silence, followed by shaky but firm words. No one wanted to leave. This was their home. More than ever, it had been Kayla's private dream of revenge. Some shopkeepers talked about the local festivals that were now part of the neighborhood calendar. Others about how for the first time they were able to employ relatives, to improve their own homes. It was a living network, made not only of contracts, but of small existences that were intertwined there. It was this quiet chorus that reignited the right spark within her. Rather than hire more lawyers or try to cut shady deals, Kayla decided to open the strip mall's accounts completely to public audit. She hired independent auditors, published transparent reports, and invited local journalists to follow every step of the way. The move was risky, but it undermined Behrman's strategy, which relied on fear, suspicion, and whispered half-truths behind the scenes. Full exposure removed the fuel that fueled the blackmail. It wasn't long before the consortium began to recede, gradually, quietly, like a tide giving up on the beach. Behrman disappeared from the headlines. Lucien stood by her side, but at a respectful distance, admiring the way she had burned bridges rather than sold them. Kayla realized something almost cynical then. Real power wasn't just about money or political influence. It was about keeping the right people willing to fight by your side. When she left her last meeting with auditors, under the sun streaming through the treetops of the parking lot, she felt air enter her lungs without resistance for the first time in a long time. She was no longer the frightened young woman who cried in the bathroom after a joke about her salary, nor the hungry woman who savored Donnelly's downfall like a rare wine. She was someone who carried all of these versions inside her, but who now understood that she didn't have to give in to the worst of them in order to stand firm. By the time Kayla turned 52, life around the strip mall was nothing like it had been when she first met her. The neighborhood, once dominated by peeling signs and streets that had more potholes than hope, had become a vibrant urban hub, crowded with young families, artists, and small local investors. Stores that had once been mere cubicles had been transformed into boutiques, signature cafes, and cooperatives that exported artisanal products across the state. The old strip mall sign, which had once bore the name of an indifferent real estate conglomerate, had now been replaced by sober letters that spelled out the name of the neighborhood, itself a symbol of belonging, not ownership. But Kayla had no romantic illusions. She knew that part of this revitalization also meant the gradual displacement of original residents. Small rent increases eventually forced some to back out, and she tried to intervene as much as she could, creating cross-subsidies, helping longtime shopkeepers formalize their businesses so they could gain credit and withstand the market. Still, the weight of gentrification was a constant specter that haunted her nights. There were days when Kayla would simply park her car far away and walk the sidewalks, studying faces. Some would smile when they recognized her, others would look away, perhaps out of hurt, perhaps out of simple shyness. Each expression fed an invisible tally in her mind, a moral accounting that never closed. During those years, Kayla created the Horizonte Institute, financed entirely by surplus profits from the strip mall and other properties she had acquired. The institute offered scholarships to the children of small business owners, free technical courses, and an aggressive microcredit program for new entrepreneurs who could not get into conventional banks. The institute's building was erected a few blocks from the strip mall, with glass walls and indoor gardens, almost as a permanent reminder that things could be done differently. But for every young person who was given a new opportunity, there were also stories that did not come true. Kayla was no fool. She saw desperate mothers, business owners, who failed despite all the help they could get, community projects that collapsed due to mismanagement. Reality was always harsher than the triumphalist reports. Once, while quietly attending a technical program graduation, Kayla watched a curly-haired girl accept her diploma with tears in her eyes. Her mother, sitting in the front row, was shaking so hard she nearly dropped her phone while trying to film it. Kayla looked away, overcome with a strange shame. She knew she wasn't anyone's savior. At best, she had created the conditions for some to run on their own. But the system out there was still as ruthless as it had always been. Often, as she watched these stories unfold, she worried that she was just prolonging a cycle of small victories that would eventually be crushed by larger machines. Kayla's personal life, on the other hand, became a constellation of distances. She never married, never had children. She had intense relationships, brief or too long, almost always doomed to dissolve when the weight of the world she carried showed its claws. In her 60s, her hair had turned uniformly gray, a beautiful metallic color, which she kept short and well-groomed. Her eyes, however, remained dark and watchful, carrying a flame that time had not been able to extinguish. The local newspapers still treated her as a pioneer, a visionary, but they no longer rushed to interview her as often. The market always had new names, younger faces, new narratives to flatter. It was one mild autumn when Kayla encountered a different kind of threat. One that didn't come in the form of blackmail or predatory funds, but rather disguised as modernity. A Californian tech fund began quietly buying up properties around the neighborhood, promising the former owners sums they couldn't refuse. At first, it seemed harmless, a few houses sold, old warehouses converted into co-working spaces. But soon rumors began to spread that the ultimate plan was to transform the entire area into a startup hub, with mirrored buildings and tiny apartments rented at exorbitant prices. Before Kayla knew it, the strip mall had become one of the few pieces still outside the control of this new conglomerate. They sent smiling representatives over, offering obscene sums to buy it outright and integrate it into the innovation ecosystem. This time, there were no veiled threats or aggressive lawyers. Everything was said with the lightness of someone who firmly believes they are on the right side of history. They promised to transform the neighborhood into a global case study in smart living, using drones for security, algorithms to predict commercial demands, an app for each customer to schedule even coffee at the local kiosk. They showed digital models so perfect that they almost seemed to be pulsating on the screen. Kayla listened to everything in silence, her expression unreadable, while inside she felt a cold rage. Not against the technology, but against the way it was wrapped in a discourse of well-being, masking a process that would crush those who could not afford that sterilized future. When she declined, she did so politely but firmly. She said she had no interest in selling or integrating the strip mall into any network that would identify it as a community space. The fund's executive, a young man in a light blue suit and an almost boyish smile, seemed puzzled. He said he couldn't understand why anyone would not take advantage of such an inevitable development. Kayla simply stood up, shook his hand, and ended the meeting. What came next were no lawsuits or smear campaigns. The fund was too smart for such outdated strategies. They chose to ignore her publicly, advancing around the strip mall like a technological tide. They installed smart cameras on every corner of the neighborhood, digital signs selling hyper-targeted ads, supermarkets without human attendants. Young people began to migrate there, seduced by amenities that the strip mall did not offer. Kayla noticed gradual declines in customer traffic. Some store owners remained loyal, others began to whisper about the need to modernize, perhaps selling part of their assets to invest in spaces within this new high-tech cluster. Kayla began to walk alone along the digital sidewalks of her neighborhood, feeling the weight of time. Every now and then a drone would silently follow her, interpreting her as curious or a potential buyer. She watched young executives walking robot dogs, couples taking selfies in front of murals created by artificial intelligence. There was nothing wrong on the surface, but to Kayla, it seemed like a spectacle carefully orchestrated to leave no room for real people. Where was the used bookseller who told stories of deceased customers? Where was the lady who sold baked bread in her backyard and smiled with the corners of her eyes crinkled? All that had vanished like dust. One night, as she closed her office in the strip mall, Kayla sat in the lobby for long minutes. The lobby was quiet, lit only by soft lamps that cast delicate shadows on the polished floor. She remembered the first time she'd walked in after she'd bought it, when the walls were still dirty and the smell of water infiltration had come from the building. She thought of Donnelly, of Tristan, of Behrman, even of Lucian. Each of them, in their own way, had tried to mold her to their own ends. Now she faced a faceless enemy, a system so efficient that it didn't even need to crush her directly. It just had to ignore her model until she became irrelevant. But as he straightened his coat and prepared to leave, Kayla had an almost cruel flash. He realized that the real triumph would not lie in destroying this sterile future. There was no stopping technological advance, no point in demonizing it entirely. But there might be a way, perhaps, to protect what mattered in resilient pockets. Small islands of humanity within automated seas. And in a way, that had always been his job, not to conquer the entire world but to drive down stakes. Small fortresses where the spirit of community could breathe. Maybe one day that too would be swallowed up, but while it lasted, while a child could run through market stalls without being tracked by predictive cameras, there would be value. When she left, she found the janitor sweeping the parking lot. He was a thin man with a gray mustache and greasy hands. He greeted her with a brief, almost embarrassed wave. Kayla stopped and asked how his family was doing. The man smiled and told her that his youngest daughter had enrolled in the Institute's technical program and dreamed of opening her own studio. That hit her so hard that she had to hold on to her purse to keep from showing it. She said goodbye with a heavy heart, got back in the car and stood there for a while, watching the strip mall building slowly fade away. She thought about how many silent stories were pulsing inside. Stories that wouldn't get likes or be printed on smart apps, but that carried the real weight of the world. And so, without announcements, headlines, or audiences, Kayla made her decision. She would not sell, she would not give in, and more than that, she would begin to look for ways to formally protect the strip mall as a cultural heritage site, legally binding its guidelines so that even future generations could not turn it into another disposable piece on the corporate chessboard. She hired specialized lawyers, mobilized local associations, encouraged residents to organize themselves into advisory boards. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and irritating on dozens of levels, but each signature, each stamped protocol was like another brick in the wall that separated that place from the predictable fate of the rest of the neighborhood. When she turned 65, Kayla went up alone to the rooftop of the strip mall's administrative building, took a bottle of cheap wine with her, and stood looking out at the city lights. In the distance, the tech district sparkled with its translucent signs and drones flashing on programmed routes. Nearby, the strip mall's lights were warmer, less uniform, some flickered irregularly. But to Kayla they had a beauty that was impossible to replicate. They were flaws that told stories. She toasted alone, didn't say a word, just drank, looking out at the horizon. She knew, in that moment, that her legacy was not a monument to perfection, but to the persistent imperfection that gives the real world flavor, smell, and memory. 20 years had passed since that silent night on the terrace when Kayla, 65, toasted alone to the imperfect lights of the strip mall. The world had advanced rapidly in ways she had already sensed. Entire cities had reorganized themselves into logistics. Networks so precise that they seemed orchestrated by symphonies of invisible algorithms. Drone deliveries had become the norm, and in many regions, physical stores had become nothing more than automated showrooms where a customer could scan their face and the system would deduce everything they wanted before they could even place an order. Credit cards, physical documents, and even cell phones had become redundant, replaced by biometric implants that facilitated every microtransaction, every door opening, every doctor's appointment. The neighborhood around the strip mall was slowly swallowed up by this hygienic modernity. Old warehouses were transformed into co-living complexes for young professionals in the technology sector. Cafes were replaced by smart capsules where a robot served the customer in less than 20 seconds. The aroma of synthetic coffee mixing with the faint ozonated odor of automated cleaning. Small theaters that tried to resist could not withstand the competition of augmented reality. Shows offered just a few steps away, where each person received a personalized show, adapted to the algorithms of their emotional history. Through it all, the strip mall remained a deliberate and The lawsuits and community outreach Kayla had initiated 2 decades earlier had not only been effective, they had become such a robust legal maze that no international fund could find a way through it without facing massive protests, boycotts, or lengthy legal embargoes. The place had become, so to speak, a quasi-independent enclave. The Cultural Protection Council that Kayla had helped form, and to which she had left full power in her will, now managed the site on behalf of a consortium of merchants, artists, and residents who took turns making decisions. Many were already children or grandchildren of the original shopkeepers, who had grown up within those walls. Kayla died at the age of 84, at home, without ceremony or dramatic hospitalization. During her final months, she insisted on staying in the apartment above her office. Even after doctors recommended specialized clinics that promised continuous AI monitoring and real-time alerts for any organic failure, she dismissed each suggestion with a patient nod, as if she were no longer surprised by the predictability of the world. When her body was found by the caretaker who had served her for almost 30 years, there was no cinematic drama, just Kayla lying there, her features serene, a blanket pulled up to her chin, the window ajar, letting in the morning air. The funeral was small but crowded. Elderly business owners, longtime employees, and former scholarship recipients from the Horizonte Institute attended and treated her with an almost uncomfortable reverence. Some journalists tried to make a spectacle of it, drawing attention to the presence of former business partners or the unusual number of spontaneous tributes spread across hand-painted posters. But there were no major revelations. Kayla had left no posthumous secrets or dramatic letters. Her story was all there, spread out in the corridors of the strip mall, in the faces that resisted keeping it alive. In the following years, the place began to receive more curious visitors. People from other neighborhoods came to see this last bastion of humanity in the middle of a city that operated almost entirely on autonomous networks. Some tourists were uncomfortable. There were no virtual assistants on every corner. Payments had to be made at real cash registers. And the cafe tables were disputed by loud conversations that would not stop when sensors detected proximity. For others, that was precisely the charm. Exaggerated rumors circulated, saying that life there was like in the 20th century, which made some older visitors laugh. It was not true. There was Wi-Fi, some shopkeepers used tablets to manage inventory. The Horizonte Institute, which now operated in 3 buildings spread across the neighborhood, used sophisticated digital solutions to teach. But everything was conducted with an almost ceremonial care so as not to nullify human relationships. However, over time, the siege began to tighten again in a more subtle way. New legislation on energy efficiency, health rules imposed by automated governance networks, and fiscal requirements shaped by tax algorithms began to clash with the strip mall's almost artisanal model. Small merchants found themselves forced to fill out digital reports that asked for parameters that were impossible to measure in businesses, where much of the control was done by the owner's old instinct, by the handshake, by trusting in the word. Some began to weaken, selling locations to smaller investors who promised to keep everything as it was, but soon introduced small changes, automated kiosks to speed up ordering, menus generated by predictive intelligence. The council resisted, but gradually understood that keeping the enclave untouched was like trying to hold water between your fingers. Within the walls of the Horizonte Institute, Kayla's legacy was maintained with almost religious rigor, frames with old photos of her, overseeing strip mall renovations, or speaking at scholarship ceremonies. Decorated hallways bathed in natural light. The multi-purpose rooms were occupied by groups learning carpentry, cooking, and sewing, alongside programming and 3D printing labs. The Institute had embraced technology, but without letting it consume its original purpose. There, the most relevant data was not how many digital interactions occurred, but how many people were able to use that knowledge to create something tangible and share it with others. On a particularly muggy day in the height of summer, one of the Institute's directors, Marcia Lunder, who had been a scholarship student at age 17 and was now in her 40s, gathered the strip mall's board of directors. She brought up some worrying data. The metrics predicted that, within 5 years, regulatory requirements would become so stringent that half of the mall's retailers would be unable to comply without radical modernization. Some board members suggested specific partnerships with local startups to implement automated compliance systems. Others proposed creating a consortium just to negotiate more flexible regulations for cultural preservation zones. Marcia listened to everyone, took careful notes, but left the meeting with a grim expression. That night, she walked alone through the strip mall. The stores were closing, some with their lights dimmed, their windows displaying hand-drawn promotional posters in colored markers. She sat on a bench near the old bookstore, now run by the founder's grandson, and watched the last of the customers pass by. She thought about Kayla, how she might have made different decisions. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. She remembered her not as a heroic figure but as a pragmatic woman who had learned to stand by her principles even when the emotional cost was almost unbearable. Days later, Marcia called another meeting. This time she proposed something that seemed too radical for some. Starting a community fund that could buy properties in the surrounding area before they were taken over by real estate algorithms. Creating a protective ring around the strip mall. The project would require donations, intense volunteerism, exhaustive campaigns to keep original residents there, supporting them with renovations, microcredits, and even direct subsidies paid by the fund. Many merchants were suspicious. It was a huge risk, but as Marcia showed graphs showing how homogenization was advancing in the neighboring neighborhoods, the assembly began to bow to reality. There was no other way. Either they would unite to protect this way of life, or they would be slowly dissolved by the silent tide of automated efficiency. When the fund was officially launched, everyone was surprised by the volume of contributions from former residents, former scholarship recipients, and artists who had started their careers performing in the strip mall squares. The echo of Kayla's work reverberated in small monthly donations, in letters sent from other states saying, "This place changed my life. Here's my part so they don't let it die." The project began by purchasing 2 residential buildings north of the strip mall and converting them into affordable housing for local families. Within a few years, they were able to repeat the operation in 6 more blocks. The press tried to turn it into a cute story of resistance to the advance of the future, but those who lived inside knew how painful it was. Full of internal tensions, fights over priorities, sleepless nights trying to close budgets that didn't add up. Even so, when Marcia sat on the steps of the Institute, watching children run around the strip mall square, she felt that each new wrinkle on her face was the fair price to pay for keeping something human standing. She thought about Kayla all the time, as if she were talking to a concrete absence that hovered in the hallways, reminding herself that the goal had never been to build an immaculate paradise, but simply to create a space where people still recognized each other as people, not as predictive profiles in a global database. On an autumn evening, with the sun tearing through the horizon in shades of copper and wine, Marcia stopped in front of Kayla's old office door, which still had the same old plaque with her name engraved on it. The room was kept almost intact, as an informal memorial, and every now and then a visitor would ask to see where she worked. Marcia went in, closed the door, and stared at the empty chair behind the desk. She felt no need to say anything, not even to herself. She just stood there, breathing in the slightly dusty air, listening to the distant sound of conversations outside, children playing, and shopkeepers closing their doors with that familiar metallic clang. It was there, in that chaotic mix of voices and creaks, that Kayla continued to live in her purest form. And it was there that Marcia decided it would be worth fighting for, even if the future insisted on arriving with its sharp algorithms and promises of perfection. 50 years have passed since Kayla's death, and the world around the former strip mall has become almost unrecognizable. The nation's cities have become vast conglomerates connected by autonomous systems that operate in perfect synchrony. Urban mobility has been given over entirely to driverless pods that flow through corridors, suspended like globules in translucent arteries. The old neighborhoods have been replaced by standardized modules, built by robotic printers that erect entire blocks in weeks. Every inch calibrated to maximize flow, minimize waste, optimize experiences. The notion of a physical neighborhood has become obsolete for many. Most social interactions occur in immersive layers, where each individual moves with avatars shaped by their immediate desires, eliminating the need to deal with the imperfect rawness of the real world. Yet at the heart of one of these urban megastructures there remained an anachronistic blemish that official maps outlined with a special line. Almost as if it were an error tolerated out of historical curiosity. There stood what had once been Kayla's strip mall, now part of an area officially recognized as a localized human preservation district. The bureaucratic name served to frame an intricate legal status, born of the maneuvers that Kayla and the council had instituted almost a century earlier, successively reinforced by community laws and donations that protected the site from purchase or annexation by corporate networks.